If your last name is German, there is a chance it once meant something more powerful than a name on a birth certificate. Long before Germany was one country, dozens of cities answered to no duke or prince. They answered only to the emperor, running their own courts and armies behind walls they paid for. One name on this list belonged to a family so wealthy they financed an emperor's election. If that name is yours, you are not just German. You may be carrying the memory of a city that ruled itself and helped decide who wore the crown. Number 10. Zimmermann. It means carpenter, and that sounds like an ordinary trade. But inside a free imperial city, carpenters were not casual laborers working for whoever could pay them. They were guild members, bound by strict charters that controlled who could build, repair, or reinforce the city's walls, gates, and defenses, and who could be shut out of the trade entirely for working outside those rules. In cities that answered directly to the emperor rather than a local lord, the guilds were often the real day-to-day government, regulating trade, prices, apprenticeships, and who was even legally allowed to call themselves a citizen. A family carrying the Zimmermann name was historically associated with exactly this kind of guild authority, the quiet power of controlling what a city was physically built from and how it was defended when an enemy army arrived at the gates. Guild records across free imperial cities preserve this name attached to structural work on fortifications that had to hold against siege, sometimes for months at a time. That is not a small detail. What came next in the guild hierarchy did not swing a hammer. It set the price of everything the hammer built. Number 9. Krämer. The old form points toward a shopkeeper or small merchant, and in a free imperial city, that was never a minor position handed to whoever wanted it. These cities survived entirely on trade rather than farmland or a prince's tax base, and merchant guilds negotiated directly with city councils over tariffs, market rights, and access to trade routes that stretched across the whole of the Holy Roman Empire and often beyond it. A name built from the marketplace was a name tied to negotiation, leverage, and the ability to make a city wealthy or leave it starving through a single bad trade agreement. Families with this name appear repeatedly in market charters and city tax rolls, not as passive residents quietly paying dues, but as people whose livelihoods and decisions actively shaped municipal policy from one council meeting to the next. This is where the name turns into something more than a job description. It becomes a claim on a city's economic survival, the kind of claim that could earn a family real influence without ever holding formal noble title. Not every guild dealt in trade you could haggle over, though. The next one answered to rules stricter than any market charter in the city. Number 9. Krämer. The old form points toward a shopkeeper or small merchant, and in a free imperial city, that was never a minor position handed to whoever wanted it. These cities survived entirely on trade rather than farmland or a prince's tax base, and merchant guilds negotiated directly with city councils over tariffs, market rights, and access to trade routes that stretched across the whole of the Holy Roman Empire and often beyond it. A name built from the marketplace was a name tied to negotiation, leverage, and the ability to make a city wealthy or leave it starving through a single bad trade agreement. Families with this name appear repeatedly in market charters and city tax rolls, not as passive residents quietly paying dues, but as people whose livelihoods and decisions actively shaped municipal policy from one council meeting to the next. This is where the name turns into something more than a job description. It becomes a claim on a city's economic survival, the kind of claim that could earn a family real influence without ever holding formal noble title. Not every guild dealt in trade you could haggle over, though. The next one answered to rules stricter than any market charter in the city. Number 8. Schumacher. Shoemaker. It sounds humble, but shoemaking in the free imperial cities was governed by some of the strictest guild regulations in the entire Holy Roman Empire, controlling apprenticeships, quality standards, and who was legally allowed to sell footwear inside the city gates at all, let alone claim mastery of the craft. Breaking guild law as an unlicensed craftsman could mean losing your livelihood entirely, sometimes your citizenship along with it, since guild membership and civic standing were often tied together in ways outsiders rarely understood. A family bearing this name was not simply making shoes for whoever walked through the door. They were operating inside one of the most tightly regulated professions a free city had, protected and controlled in equal measure by charters some cities defended for centuries against outside competition. Guild membership rolls preserve the name attached to workshops that were inspected, taxed, and legally protected from anyone trying to undercut the trade from outside the city walls. Most people never hear that part. Step outside the guild halls entirely, though, and the story stops being about a trade. It becomes about a place. Number 7. Ulmer. Say it slowly. This is not a description of a job or a personality trait passed down through generations. It is a person's origin, spoken plainly. Someone from Ulm, one of the great free imperial cities of the Holy Roman Empire, a walled city on the Danube famous for its cathedral spire and its far-reaching trade networks. Surnames like this were incredibly common precisely because the free imperial cities were so distinct from the surrounding countryside that simply saying where you came from told people everything about your rights, your trade connections, and your legal status the moment you arrived somewhere new. If your ancestors carried the Ulmer name, historical migration and settlement records suggest a family that once left the specific protection of Ulm's walls and carried the city's name with them as a form of identification long before passports existed. The city disappeared from the family's daily life over the generations that followed. The name did not disappear with it. One walled city gave its name to wandering families. The next one gave its name to the making of emperors. Number 6. Frankfurter. This name does not just point to a city. It points to the single most politically significant city in the entire Holy Roman Empire, a city whose importance had nothing to do with its size and everything to do with what happened inside its walls once every few years. Frankfurt was where the empire's electors gathered to choose the next emperor, and later where emperors were formally crowned in a cathedral still standing today. A family carrying this name was historically associated with a city that stood at the exact center of imperial power, even if that family never sat among the electors themselves or attended a single coronation in person. Merely living in, working in, or being formally recorded as coming from Frankfurt placed a family inside the most consequential political stage in Central Europe, whether they intended it or not. Later records show the name spreading through trade and migration far beyond the city's walls, carrying a fragment of that political weight into ordinary households scattered across the wider empire. Most people carrying this name today have no idea it once marked a connection to the exact city where the Holy Roman Empire chose and crowned its rulers. Political weight is one kind of inheritance to carry. What the next family left behind is something you can still walk up to inside a museum. Number 5. Behaim. This is where the list stops speculating and starts naming documented history, the kind with dates, ledgers, and surviving physical objects behind it. The Behaim family was a real, well-recorded patrician family of Nuremberg, one of the wealthiest and most independent free imperial cities in the entire empire. Martin Behaim, born into this family, created the oldest surviving globe of the Earth still in existence today, built in the final years before European sailors reached the Americas, and forever changed what that globe would have needed to show. Families bearing this name were not simply merchants counting coins in a back room. They were part of Nuremberg's ruling patrician class, the families who sat on city councils and financed the exploration and trade networks that were quietly redrawing the map of the known world before most of Europe had caught up. The surname tradition tied to Behaim reaches directly into documented civic government and one of the most remarkable individual achievements of the era, an object you can still see in a museum today. If this is your name, the old records are not implying influence somewhere in the background. In this case, they are recording a family that helped chart the edge of the map itself, centuries before anyone knew how large that map would eventually become. A single explorer's globe is one kind of legacy. A family's name, carved into a city council for generations, is an entirely different one. Number 4. Tucher. This is one of the oldest documented patrician families of Nuremberg, appearing in city council records for centuries, tied directly to the governance of one of the wealthiest and most independent free imperial cities in the entire Holy Roman Empire. Families bearing this name were not simply wealthy merchants standing at a distance from power, content to fund politics from the sidelines. They were named participants in it, holding council seats generation after generation, managing trade agreements with distant cities, and shaping the laws that governed one of the empire's most fiercely independent urban centers. That is not a naming tradition built on suggestion or family legend. That is a documented dynasty, traceable through the same kinds of civic records historians still study today to understand how free imperial cities actually governed themselves without a prince or bishop standing over them, answerable to their own councils, and, above them, only to the emperor himself. If this is your name, the records are not hinting at influence somewhere in the background. They are recording it directly, in the council minutes of a city that answered to no one but the emperor. Council seats bought influence inside the walls. What the next family built didn't stop at the city gate at all. Number 3. Imhoff. Say it carefully, because this name carried real financial weight through the history of Nuremberg, weight that outlasted several generations of city politics. The Imhoff family were patrician merchants and bankers, deeply embedded in the city's ruling class, with trade and financial connections that reached beyond German lands entirely into the wider European banking networks that funded emperors, wars, and the great trading expeditions of the age. Families with this name were often associated with the machinery of civic and financial power at once, not simply the marketplace, but the private negotiating rooms where loans to princes and merchants were actually arranged, secured, and sometimes called in when a debtor least expected it. That is a different kind of danger than a guild charter, the kind built on financial leverage that could make or break the fortunes of people far more powerful than the family itself, simply by choosing where to extend credit and where to withhold it. The name survived shifting fortunes, changing trade routes, and centuries of civic upheaval that ended lesser merchant families completely, wiping their names from the council registers entirely. Most people never hear that part. Loans and leverage are one kind of power inside a city. What came next crossed an entire ocean to prove a different kind. Number 2. Welser. This is where the story turns almost impossible to believe, and yet it is entirely real, documented in trade agreements and imperial grants rather than legend. The Welser family of Augsburg, another great free imperial city, were bankers and merchants so powerful that the Holy Roman Emperor personally granted them a colonial concession in what is now Venezuela, an arrangement historians still refer to by the name Klein Venedig, or Little Venice. A German patrician banking family briefly held direct control over a colonial territory on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, sending their own governors and expeditions, a level of reach that most royal houses of the era never came close to matching with an entire crown behind them. Records connected to this name do not describe a quiet, local merchant family content with regional trade. They describe a banking dynasty whose ambition stretched from the guild halls of Augsburg to the coastline of South America and back again in the space of a single generation. A name that sounds unfamiliar today once controlled territory, an ocean away from the city that made it wealthy, backed by nothing but capital and an emperor's signature. That is not a naming tradition built on distant association. That is a family whose reach genuinely crossed the known world of its time. And now we arrive at the name that made even the Welsers look modest by comparison. Number 1. Fugger. Say it out loud, because this is the name that changes the scale of everything on this list. The Fugger family of Augsburg is widely considered the wealthiest banking dynasty in European history, a fortune so vast that when Charles V needed money to secure his election as Holy Roman Emperor against rival candidates backed by other royal houses, it was the Fuggers who financed it, effectively helping decide who would wear the imperial crown itself. A surname built from this family does not merely gesture toward wealth the way other entries on this list carefully do. It carries the name of the family whose loans propped up emperors, funded wars across the continent, and financed trade routes stretching from Central Europe to the edges of the known world, preserved in banking records, imperial correspondence, and documented economic history still studied in universities today. The name does not prove that every modern bearer descends from the Fugger dynasty itself, but historically, it belongs to a family whose private decisions briefly outweighed the treasuries of kings, a level of leverage almost no merchant family in history has matched before or since. Of every name on this list, this is the one that reaches the furthest, because it reaches for the very throne of the empire that all these free imperial cities once swore loyalty to, and it was a merchant family's money, not a soldier's sword, that helped decide who sat on it. 10 names, 10 different doors into the same vanished world of guild halls that governed cities, marketplaces that decided a family's fortune, city names carried forward as identity, and banking dynasties whose fortunes briefly outweighed the treasuries of kings. A surname is never just a label sitting quietly on a document, filled in without a second thought. It is a compressed history, carrying pieces of cities that once answered to no one but an emperor, guild charters that shaped entire trades for centuries, and financial empires that reached across oceans without a single soldier or ship of their own to enforce it. If one of these names is yours, you are not just looking at a family tree stretching backward on a screen. You are looking at a fragment of a city that once governed itself, defended by its own guilds and financed by its own merchants rather than any prince, carried forward by families who never called themselves historians, Just survivors who kept a name and a trade alive across generations of war, trade collapse, and shifting borders. Comment your surname below, along with the region or city your family traces back to, and tell me which forgotten name, guild, or free imperial city you want decoded next. Because somewhere out there, another ordinary name on another mailbox is still waiting to be traced all the way back to a city that once answered to no one but an emperor.